Hello and welcome back to the channel. I'm Dan, and this is Forlorn Hobbies. Hello and welcome back to the channel. Firstly, I'd like to apologise for the lack of uploads over the past couple of weeks. That has been because I have been frantically painting with every spare minute that I have had in preparation for the contents of today's video, which is, of course, an event review for Napoleonic Wargaming's Under Eagles to Glory 2 event at Boards and Swords in Derby. Now, before we get into the details of the event itself, regular viewers of the channel will know that there was quite a lot riding on this event for myself and Ian over at Ian Hobbies, because we had a bet on to paint an army for this event, and then if we'd both managed that, the grudge match would decide who was going to paint the Prussians. Now, I can confirm that I failed spectacularly at getting my Russians ready for the event. I'm my own worst enemy when it comes to painting, because I don't think I appreciated how much detail there was on some of the kits. So I obviously went down the rabbit hole of trying to pick out a lot more detail than I had originally planned, and I got lots of little bits done here and there, but nothing really kind of on a unit level besides a brigade of infantry. So I, of course, had to turn to Tim and nick his Russian army for the weekend. So there will be lots of suffering in the near future for me as I undertake a Prussian army. Now, I will return to that a bit more at the end of the video, but I just wanted to get that out the way because I can hear Ian doing his hippie bounce in celebration and cheering already from the word go in this video. So I just wanted to admit defeat and get it off my chest before we got on with the main content of the event. So the event itself consisted of 4 games over the weekend, made up of 600-point army list from the Black Powder supplements, and we would be playing some scenarios that Tim had written for this event series, so to speak. So I know there was a couple of changes from the previous Under Eagles to Glory, and it's kind of smoothing out, I think, in the playtesting now that they've been developed and we can see the results on the tabletop. I know Tim was very happy with the previous event, but seeing the scenarios play out, he just wanted to make a couple of changes. I think he removed the built-up areas scenario and replaced it with a different one. I couldn't tell you which one because I've played so many games with Tim and talked about it so many times. I think it was the dawn attack scenario, but I could be wrong. And yeah, it was just the main aim of this event wasn't to crush your opponent and podium, but rather to just share in the enjoyment of historical wargaming and not necessarily playing someone that you play all the time. Because I find with historical gaming that you kind of have your little groups that you tend to play with all the time, and there's not really much in the way of kind of cross-club interaction unless it's at like a kind of big meet. But even if you go to the shows such as Hammerhead, Partisan, there are a lot of participation games, but there's not really any kind of formal structure to it. It's this club will put on this game, just come and help out, have a go, kind of thing. Whereas I know Tim is really passionate about kind of sharing that involvement and kind of bringing together people that necessarily wouldn't have an opportunity to play each other otherwise. And I think that is an excellent kind of goal to be focused on. And looking at the attendance this year, there were quite a few familiar faces, but there were also newer players. So it was really good to see, how the group kind of adapted and embraced each other. And I think I can speak for everyone in saying that we all had a very enjoyable weekend. Now, as is tradition for any event at Boards and Swords, we obviously started off the pre-event celebrations at the Smithfield Arms with a traditional award-winning pork pie and some beverages. I will blame our good friends from across the border, Paul and Ian, for the shenanigans that went down with the excessive consumption of whiskey and beer, and extend apologies to Felix once again for the British reception that he received, especially from our Scottish friends. Having travelled all the way from Munich for this event, it was quite a loud experience for him, so I hope he enjoyed it, and hopefully it hasn't put him off from coming to the next event next year. So I would love to say my lateness for arrival on Saturday morning was to do with an excessive hangover. However, the sad reality was that I was just sleep deprived from painting until 3 a.m. every night for the past 3 weeks building up to this event, and my body had obviously just forgotten what a good night's sleep was, because I was up at 7 o'clock. I sat down on the bed to just, check some messages, and then the next thing that I knew, Tim was phoning me going, "Where are you?" So obviously, because I had both mine and his armies in my car, because I am the taxi, I had to then rush over and give him his army to play the first game, because he was feeling particularly charitable with his French, as usual, and that meant that I got to kind of have a bit more of a relaxing time and was able to kind of wander around downstairs and help out some of the newer players. I always enjoy doing this kind of thing at an event like this, because there's no pressure on kind of having to think about tactics really in the game, because it's not overly competitive, and I just get a lot more enjoyment out of seeing other people engage and enjoy themselves in the hobby. So most of my time was spent with Ian and Mitchell in quite a engaging game with his Austrians and Ian's Portuguese, and as well as helping out a couple of the other players that needed it when demanded. Now, Paul, with his insane British cavalry-dominated list, that when he first approached me and was like, "Oh, I want to have a British army, but I want as many cavalry units in it as possible," I was kind of like, well, I don't necessarily think that this list is going to do much, because of obviously forming square and whatever not. I thought it would just charge, bounce, but Paul seemed to have a whale of a time and managed to roll up an Austrian flank game one. And I don't know how he was even standing after his crazy exploits the night before, but he was in a far better shape than I was. And it just led to some very entertaining moments. So it was nice to have that time to go around and see what each player had brought and look at their armies and just kind of have a general kind of chat with everyone to kind of just to see their passions for the hobby. Now, I was a bit concerned that some people were confused that they were coming to a Middle-earth event instead because the 9 were present. Now, there was a few noticeable lack of cloaks, obviously, and no rings, but I think a British army is the equivalent of a ring of power, and it does terrible things to the person that was collecting it. So, last year it was Austrians and Russians that dominated. This year, we had half the attendance with British armies, which, seeing that amount of British line infantry units and cavalry, was quite a daunting prospect. So, there was lots of British civil wars, which, looking at the way that people approached each game, they made it fun and interesting, and I think that's what works about the scenarios, is that even if you have mirror matches, so to speak, it still makes it fun and engaging, and that is 100% down to the spirit in which all the players approach this event. Game 2 saw my return to the tabletop, as Tim had received a thorough beating by our good friend Chris at Vital Ground Creative and his dastardly Prussians, and I was up against the Under Eagles to Glory's first event's furthest travelling opponent in Emil, and this year he had returned to defend his title with a Württemberg army, and from what he had painted, it looked incredible, and I cannot wait to see the finished army. Now, this game was the debut of my Russian brigade and the loot that I had acquired from Tim, and it was a breakthrough where the attacker had to get units off the board, and the defender got units for got points for preventing units from getting off. Now, we rolled the dice, and Emil was the defender, so it was up to the Russians to do what they did best, and attack. And that was how it was supposed to go on paper, but Emil's Jaegers had something to say about the matter. They broke an infantry brigade and the grenadiers by themselves, and they must have just been sitting there eating their onion stew out of the Pavlovsky miters and enjoying the scenes of carnage. We had a good little engagement with our cavalry where I advanced across the lake, died. Emil then returned and advanced across the lake, and we both died. So it was a thoroughly entertaining and enjoyable game against a great opponent in Emil, and I will look forward to playing him again at a future event. Now, I will add a caveat. I'm going to do what I can to whisper to Tim to ban Emil from taking Jaegers, because it wasn't just me, but they were doing unspeakable things to their opponents across the whole weekend. So I think some kind of FAQ needs to be done on those. But all in all, it was a fantastic game, and we had a good laugh. There was some bets going on how many units he could disorder. A lot was the case, and I got a thorough thrashing, but as I said, it was a very enjoyable game. Now, each day only had 2 games, so it was then time for a brief break where I almost fell asleep and missed the evening's festivities, where we again descended upon the curry house and had a lovely meal with great conversations. However, I was feeling rather tired and almost ended up wearing my dinner when I nearly fell asleep in my plate, so I thought it was time to call it a night and head back about 9 o'clock to have a good night's sleep so that I could be well in a much better position than I was that morning for the next day. Day 2 started off in stark contrast to day 1. I was up bright and early, ready for my game 3 against Mitchell and his Austrians. Now, we were playing the lengthwise scenario on the short board edges, so it was kind of like a meeting engagement where you had a staggered arrival and you needed to order your brigades on to the board. Now, given my horrendous dice rolling the day before, and having experienced Mitchell's dice rolling from his game 1 against Ian, I was of the opinion that it would be a very close contest and the game would be over with nothing on the board in the 9 allotted turns. However, Mitchell's luck particularly did improve after hypothetical offerings of the innocents to the dice gods, and we had quite an entertaining game where my Russians were soundly beaten. I think it was a rarity for me to pass a save, and it made my dice made Tim's rolling on the channel look good. It even made our friend Richie's rolling in our big games look good, which was quite a feat, but I think that's what I deserved for not painting my whole army and having to borrow Tim's stuff. So it was mainly Tim's stuff that was dying, so I was fully supportive and encouraging of Mitchell's pursuit in their destruction. And obviously I lost the game, but it was a pleasure again to play Mitchell, and we had a great time. We also established that the line of sacrifices to the dice gods was puppies, because that was when Mitchell's rolling started to deteriorate once more. But overall, it was a really fun and enjoyable game, and I would quite happily have a rematch at the next event. Now, the final game was the one that had all the stakes riding on it. The grudge match, the decider, who would be the one to suffer with the Prussians. Well, at least that's how we'd planned it, because I'd not painted my Russians. It kind of took all the hype out of it, and all that was left was to enjoy listening to the final minutes of the Hibernian game on BBC Radio and play to salvage a bit of honour in the disgrace of failing the bet. The scenario was a bit of a random deployment, kind of a bit like Fog of War from the old fantasy scenarios, and besides that, victory points would be awarded for just killing and destroying your opponent. So, with my dice having abandoned me for both my games, making our good friend Richie, who viewers might know from watching Napoleonic Wargaming's big live stream games, the famous blundering and terrible rolling that is his, it made him look like a professional dice roller. But I think the dice were feeling sorry for me, or I had been saving up for this game, because it was a complete turnaround, and I think both myself and Ian were in hysterics just because of dice. When he would cause a lot of wounds, and I would save all of them, which was unheard of for my performances previously at the event. And throughout the game, I think I tallied it up. I failed no more than 10 armor saves, or morale saves. Ian, in contrast, his dice had abandoned him, and it was very rare for him to pass saves. And I think the grudge match took 5 turns for Ian's army to break. The Russians had finally discovered what they were supposed to do: forget shooting, fix the bayonets, and charge. First turn charge, breaks a unit. Second turn, breaks another. And they basically were just a steam train of pain towards those poor Portuguese. A notable mention to the MVPs, which were the Cossacks, with their dastardly flanking. And I've always said it, I think Cossacks are the 99.9% strength of the Russian army in both coolness and ability, so I do not understand why their rules are as bad, but my dice were with me, and Ian's were not. But I don't think we stopped laughing the whole game, but it was an absolute bloodbath, and I can feel that honour was somewhat restored after losing the bet. So it's kind of placated me with having to paint Prussians, but it was an absolutely outstanding way to end the event with an impressive 58-0 victory going into with the last game. But on the bright side for Ian, Hibernian did win, so he had a small consolation in that to keep him in high spirits after that game. With the games done, it was time for the awards. Now, the awards for this event are there to celebrate hobby and sportsmanship as opposed to like gaming skills. So there was no rankings involved. And the first award was Best French Army, and that went to Martin, who had done an incredible job with his French army. Now, Martin attended the event the previous year with his Russians, and saw the lack of French players, because I think there was only one, and decided and took it upon himself to paint a French army for the event. So that was inspiring to see, a complete army that he'd done over the year to kind of make up in his mind for that gap and that for his opponents rather than his preference. So huge credit to him for winning the Best Painted French award. And then the next painting award was the Best of the Coalition, and that was a very close contest between quite a few British armies, but Rob managed to eke it with his stunning Austrian army. Now, I am a massive Austrian fan, and it was lovely to see how much colour he could get into that army. And to make it stand out, everything about it just kind of brought it all together. The basing enhanced the model, and I was talking to Tim standing by the door, watching him play half the store away, and you could still make out the units that he had just because of how everything went together and made it pop. So he was a well-worthy winner. But I find that looking at this event and just looking at all the attendees, it tells a great story of people's hobby journeys, and it's really nice to see because of the limited criteria that Tim set in for the army representation, so to speak. You had the old guard with their painted armies that had been painted for years, perhaps, and were fully painted to a very high standard. You had some people that were working on new projects, so it was, you could look half done, but you could see the journey that they were going on, and that you could kind of envisage that end result, like Emil's Württemberg army. Very high standard of painting, and that on the units that he had finished, so you could kind of envisage what it would be at the end. And then you also had the newer players that had been inspired to take up the challenge and just come along and take a plunge into the game. So next year it will be interesting for me to see where people are in their journeys, and the people that were new this time, if they return, how much they've progressed, and like the effort and the passion that they've have for the hobby, to see how that's grown. And that's the one thing that, you know, I like about the event the most, is the inclusiveness. You don't have the gatekeeping that's traditionally present with the old grognards, with historical wargaming, going, oh, I'm not going to play because you can't paint that button in the correct shade, or oh, you've not done the facings this colour. Actually, it's brass rather than silver. Like, every gaming community has certain elements where a very small minority kind of not ruin it, but try and gatekeep on everyone else. So it's nice to see that inclusiveness that this event brings, and I hope that it can continue for as long as Tim is able to run it. The final award for hobby aspect, before we get on to the all-important one, was most sporting. Now, I believe most players received at least one vote, and I think the end result was a six-way tie, where it went down to who could roll the highest on a dice. I forget who won, because I can see your face, I just cannot remember names. But I think just looking at the overall atmosphere of the event itself, it was an incredibly positive experience that was full of enjoyment, and I don't think there was any wrestling, punching, or any of that sort, which has happened at previous events that I have attended. So that's always good, and I hope that moving forwards that mentality can continue. So the most important award, I think, for the players at the event was who would win the furthest travelled. Now, Emil was obviously there to defend his title, but we had a strong challenger in Felix, and due to my short game 4, me and Tim had the maps out, and we were trying to plot it, thinking, Switzerland and Bavaria, you could have a clear winner in that. But it turns out that it wasn't as straightforward, and it could have been down to about 20 miles, depending on where they lived, and they were swinging from side to side. So in the end, we went up to Emil and was like, oh, what town do you come from? And we asked Felix as well. So we had a slightly disappointing gap of about 100 miles in the end between Fribourg and Munich, and Felix managed to snatch Emil's title off him. So hopefully Felix will be back to defend that next year. and Emil might even move house to try and reclaim it. We shall see what happens. Perhaps someone will attend from even further away. But I think the main thing from this is it just shows how much Tim has put in to building this community where people are willing to travel that distance just to have a bunch of games with some strangers based on their shared passion in the stuff that Tim puts out. And I know he puts in a lot of effort and probably deserves a bit more appreciation, because he does a fantastic job. And I spend most of the time talking to him about things and playing games with him, beating the French on his channel, being beaten as the French on the channel. That still remains a goal for us, is to win a battle report with the French. So it's nice to see all his hard work pay off, for him, and that he can see people's enjoyment in what he does. And I hope that he continues to run the event. I know he's also planning to do an epic event later in the year to try and branch out a bit more in that inclusiveness. And I think for my part, I will be a willing taxi to help him in his endeavours going forwards. So, just before we end, what to expect going forwards? Well, I'm going to continue with the Russian army building series because I feel that that's incomplete, and not being able to finish certain units has kind of made me want to carry on and just get videos. So there should be one on dragoons, artillery, Cossacks, because they deserve all the love and attention that they should get. And I am going to keep that journey up until I have finished my overall project, which is greater than the 600 points for the list for the event. So hopefully throughout this year we can get that series brought to its completion, as well as starting a similar series on the Prussians as a result of losing the bet. Now, we have the Prussians to hand already, so we will be starting that. Now, I've kind of taken a little bit of a liberty with the choice of Prussians. I've decided that for the epic event, because I do not have an epic army, but I will no doubt be in attendance, that I will do the Prussians as a project for that. So it won't be as an in-depth series as the Russians, because it will only be the 12.5 13mm scale, but there will be a video along the lines of army building and that for them, which will also be applicable to a 28mm or even a 2mm army. I find it's quite a generic kind of topic to talk about army building within Black Powder, so there will at least be a video on that. There might be a video from abroad, as me and Tim are off to Waterloo in June, so maybe I might try and paint some Prussians at Plassenoir or Wavre, maybe at Waterloo, but that will depend if they turn up on time. So we shall see. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one. Thanks for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe. Until next time, enjoy your hobby.